Welcome to The Criminologist, the podcast dedicated to educating and entertaining our listeners. We bring you subject matter experts from around the world and share the latest and greatest evidence-based practices and interventions to help individuals desist from a life of crime and delinquency. Now please, welcome the host of The Criminologist, Joseph Arvidsson.
Hello and welcome to episode 191 of the Criminologist Podcast. Happy to have you all with us today. Today marks a special episode in our journey through the dynamic and ever-evolving landscape of criminal justice and rehabilitation. We have the distinct honor of hosting a luminary in the field, Professor Deborah Koetzle, from the esteemed John Jay College of Criminal Justice. Her groundbreaking work and research have not only illuminated the path to effective correctional practices, but have also redefined the boundaries of rehabilitation within the criminal justice system. Professor Koetzle's career is a mosaic of dedication, innovation, and transformative impact. Recently, she has added a new feather to her cap by joining me on the American Probation and Parole Association's International Relations Committee. This appointment is a testament to her extensive expertise and her commitment to shaping the future of probation and parole on a global scale. Her role in this committee is more than just a position. It is a platform to influence and drive international discourse on best practices in criminal justice. Her research, deeply rooted in correctional rehabilitation, spans a broad spectrum of critical areas in the field, from exploring the intricacies of problem-solving courts to delving into the nuances of risk-need assessments. Professor Koetzle's work provides invaluable insights into the complexities of the correctional process. Her studies stand at the intersection of theory and practice, offering evidence-based solutions to some of the most pressing challenges in criminal justice reform. Moreover, Professor Koetzle's contributions extend beyond the borders of the United States, venturing into cross-cultural studies of prison-based programs. Her comparative research offers a unique perspective on the global stage, highlighting the diverse approaches to correctional rehabilitation across different cultural and legal contexts. This work is crucial in understanding the universal challenges faced by correctional systems and the innovative solutions employed worldwide. This April, Professor Koetzle and I will be among the esteemed participants at the 6th World Congress on Probation and Parole in The Hague. This prestigious event is a convergence of the brightest minds in the field, coming together to discuss, debate, and shape the future of probation and parole. It is an exciting opportunity to exchange ideas, learn from international experts, and gain insights into the latest trends and best practices in correctional rehabilitation. Our participation in this Congress signifies our shared commitment to fostering global dialogue and collaboration in the pursuit of more effective and humane criminal justice systems. Today, our conversation with Professor Koetzle promises to be enlightening and thought-provoking. We will delve deep into her experiences with developing best practice standards, particularly for adult drug courts, and discuss the transformative power of cognitive behavioral interventions in reducing recidivism. We will also explore the critical aspects of program fidelity, uncovering the nuances of ensuring effectiveness in correctional settings. As we navigate these topics, we will tap into Professor Koetzle's wealth of knowledge and experience, seeking to understand not just the what, and how of correctional interventions, but also the why behind them. Her insights are not merely academic. They are practical, actionable, and fundamentally geared towards creating a more just and rehabilitative criminal justice system. So please, enjoy my conversation with Professor Deb Koetzle, and I will see you all on the other side. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Deb. So glad to have you on the show. I can, as a quick aside, also welcome you. You're the latest member of our International Relations Committee on the American Probation and Parole Association's efforts to sort of globally spread what we're doing here in probation and parole and corrections. So I'm thrilled to have you on the podcast talking about some of your awesome initiatives. Why don't we start out with, I guess, sort of a two-part question. Part one, introductory, but also just tell us, who inspired you to get into this field? I always tell folks that there's so many different pathways for practitioners that want to get into corrections, probation, and parole. But what inspired you to get into not just corrections, but correctional rehabilitation? And I know you're an academic, and I love the research angle of what we do. So maybe shed some light on those pathways for the listener.
Sure. Well, first, thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to be talking with you, and especially about these topics. I did not take a really traditional pathway. I had no idea what I wanted to do when I was younger, sort of bounced around different things. And in college, I took a class on prisons, on correctional institutions, and it just grabbed my attention like nothing else ever had. I was really fascinated to think about the culture of prisons, about, what happens to people that live there and so forth. And so I decided to get my master's degree in criminology. And while doing that, I thought, I'll go be a lawyer, right? Because that's what everyone does. And I had one professor who said, no, you write too well to be a lawyer, and there's too many lawyers anyway. Go get your PhD. And I was like, oh, okay. But during my master's degree, I also had the chance to do an internship at a medium security prison in Indiana, which is where I was living at the time. And so I went every day for a summer. I spent time in every aspect of the prison, including up in a watchtower for a day, and learned that I didn't know that I was cut out to work in a prison, but I definitely wanted, again, to know more about this. And I worked in the transition unit. That was my main assignment there, where they were, this was back in the 1990s, helping people transition from prison to the community. And I loved what I was doing. They let me come back and volunteer. I did like a 3-hour talk once a month about recognizing the signs of child abuse, which I realize now maybe wasn't the most effective thing, but it felt really important. And so I decided, let me go get my PhD. I was really interested in issues of disparity in prison. It's obvious if you walk into a prison that it's a problem. And so when I ended up going to the University of Cincinnati and thought that I would focus on disparity, but as you might know, my professors were people like Frank Cullen, John Wooldridge, Pat Van Voorst, and of course, Ed Latessa. And so rehabilitation became just a part of who I was and who I was becoming as a scholar. So Ed asked me to work with him, I think my second year of grad school, and I started working on a drug court project. But really just, I think, have followed his mission, which was all about improving outcomes, right? Improving the lives of people that are impacted in the system. So I came by it somewhat accidentally, but it definitely feels like where I'm meant to be.
You mentioned you took that one course in prisons as an undergraduate. I recall, and I'm going to date myself here, but a lot of folks in the field from my generation can relate to this as well, that as undergraduates, those courses were embedded, first of all, in the criminal justice major degree, so to speak. But back then, and this was back in the 1980s at least, you couldn't take a class on probation or parole. The closest we got was taking a class on corrections, but corrections was working in the prisons, working in the jails. And now I know I've talked a lot with Marcus Hodges and Brian Levins on this, but this whole notion of probation officers wearing two hats, we're really starting to challenge and push back on that, because I think it creates almost this false dichotomy, or, you're on this spectrum of, well, sometimes you're in a law enforcement role, sometimes you're in a social worker role, but we feel the reality is, you're really neither. We haven't really defined what it is to be a change agent. And now, even as you speak, Deb, you remind me, I wonder if it's because we're embedding those probation parole classes within the university's criminal justice programs versus their human services programs, social work programs. And it just, you said how you stumbled in this because you started seeing the disparities and whatnot. And I can attest to this myself, my own journey. I was in that sort of trail them, nail them, and jail them. We just were sort of brought up thinking our role was public safety, and we aligned more with law enforcement, the prosecutors, and that in hindsight was just such a mistake.
100% agree. I think one of the big challenges, we have lots of big challenges. One of the big challenges, I think, is how we train our students. That, as you said, many of the people going into probation, parole, I would argue even within correctional institutions, a lot of them are coming out of criminal justice training or criminal justice programs. We don't provide classes on R&R. We don't provide classes on treatment. We don't provide classes on group interventions, right? It's sort of the basic structure of the criminal justice system. But then at the same time, you have people coming out of social work programs or other human services programs that don't necessarily understand the legal system and what happens with institutions and, security issues and balancing that tension. And so I think, and I hope at some point, there will be a better marriage between criminal justice and social work. I have a colleague, Craig Schwalbe, who's at Columbia University, and he's in the School of Social Work. That's his background. And so I love working with him because our disciplines, our backgrounds complement each other quite well. And I keep saying we need to join forces and write that book that needs to be in the hands of people going into the field to work.
I should note, for the record, because I do teach both at the undergraduate and graduate level here in Minnesota, and at least the undergraduate program that I used to teach was a probation and parole class. But again, It was embedded as a criminal justice elective. So a lot of those students, just like me, that thought, I'm drawn to law enforcement. I kind of like that, growing up watching Starsky and Hutch, that sort of good guys, bad guys, kind of thing. But then for me, at least, it was, but I'm just not cut out for the blood and guts, or other people that don't want to walk into the middle of a domestic violence call. And we sort of thought, but I can get into probation and I don't quite have to get my hands as dirty, but I can still be in that sort of cops and robbers role. So my course that I started teaching about 20 years ago, and it's funny, I reflect back on some of the early syllabi. It started out as just sort of a mechanical nuts and bolts. I mean, literally, Deb, things like issuance of a probation violation warrant and what goes, the different components of a pre-sentence investigation. But as I grew and I evolved, now those classes are essentially criminology classes. And I am teaching, as you noted, the risk needs responsivity model and things of those things of that nature. But that's not the trend. That's not the trend.
It's not the norm, sadly. And it's more, you need more than one class.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
So.
You mentioned when you were at the University of Cincinnati studying, you were assigned a drug court project. And I know that sort of continued as a passion of yours. We do see a trend, the good news is, in probation and parole with so-called specialty courts. Some people can relate to them, whether they're drug courts or DUI courts. I know I've even seen veterans courts set up, more commonly known as problem-solving courts. Could you explain to the listener out there that is maybe working in a jurisdiction that doesn't have the capacity to have those courts, what the concept is of those problem-solving courts, and in particular, I'm a big assessment guy, how risk need assessments really play a crucial role in what we do in corrections.
Absolutely. And it's funny, I started working on drug courts and I'm currently working on a big drug court project right now. So it's sort of feeling very full circle in my career. So, as you know, drug courts and problem solving courts more generally, really, it's a way to keep people at home in the community and yet bridge together the supervision that probation provides, the treatment that people are in need of, along with the court. And I think that's part of what really makes this type of approach unique is that, in a traditional jurisdiction without a drug court, you have someone come in, and I'll focus on drug courts just because they're sort of the model for everything. You have someone come in on drug charges, they're in need of treatment, and they go in front of the judge, they're convicted, they're maybe placed on probation, and the judge doesn't see them again. Right? Unless they get into trouble again or there's some unique thing happening. With a drug court, the judge is much more engaged. And so an individual in a drug court is going to go back to court for a status hearing every couple of weeks, maybe even weekly at the front. And in addition to going back to the judge, the treatment provider is there and the probation officer is there, and that team, along often with the prosecutor, a defense attorney, maybe law enforcement, that team is then kind of collectively paying attention to how someone is doing and what their progress is in terms of sort of moving forward in their life. Some might argue the opposite. It's meant to be a more forgiving model, right? It's meant to acknowledge that relapse occurs. Change is not easy. It takes time. And it's meant to have a lot of structure in place that lessens over time so that as people are really maybe in those early stages of behavior change or maybe not even ready for behavior change, there's more structure, there's more support, but as they make progress, that's going to lessen. And so it really started as a way to keep people out of prison. And it's evolved since I think 1989 was the first drug court in Miami. They've evolved to your point of all different types of courts, but really I think a key is that collaboration, the treatment and the judge.
Deb, you mentioned that originally these were set up to be more of a forgiving model. And I'm just wondering, in your experience, is the key to success then educating those other stakeholders you mentioned as to, for example, the risk need responsivity model, which is to say, have you experienced sometimes that the framework's in place, it's set up, but if you don't have a judge or a prosecutor or someone on board that doesn't understand the sort of harm reduction model and are used to more of that binary pass-fail probation violation approach, that if you're not bought in with the spirit of it, then it is just then sort of in violation of the risk principle. And you're just dragging these people in to court, not to affirm them and to celebrate them, but as they're always used to, well, here we go, another degradation ceremony, as Shad Maruna would say.
Yeah, that's right. Yes. So I think you're right. I think that your drug court team or your problem-solving court team all needs to be on the same page, where our focus is improving lives, right? It's helping to facilitate desistance. It's helping to reduce recidivism. It's helping to reduce drug use, and doing so in a way that's consistent with the evidence on behavior change. So it's not, you've got a positive UA, we're locking you up. There are graduated sanctions, graduated responses, but that the rewards are equally important. I would argue that the drug court model should really serve for a model of what we do across community corrections, that need for collaboration doesn't stop outside of a drug court, right? The need for probation and treatment to be communicating with one another, to be allowing for failure on the way to change, that should not be just one small part of the system.
I was on a call recently with David Best and Charlotte Coleman, and we were talking about a lot of things, but we got into recovery and how there's a lot of similarities with desistance from crime. And David did point out the one thing was that whereas we've come a long way as a society as far as accepting individuals who've struggled with chemicals, to the point now, Deb, where people can wear that sobriety badge as a badge of honor. People celebrate, I'm 10 years sober, I'm 20 years sober, I'm 30 years free of drugs and alcohol. We're not quite there yet with criminality. You don't see people wearing that desistance badge of honor saying, yes, I'm 10 years crime free. And we have these big celebrations. And I just wonder, I thought of this when you were talking about, again, the celebrating and the affirming notion of drug courts. As trainers, we all know about the 4-to-1 ratio of positive to negative feedback. But yeah, do you see that as sort of the next challenge is getting not just the stakeholders, but society to equate people leading a crime-free life, just as they equate that with, you've turned your life around and you're sober. That's awesome. Let's celebrate that. You don't have to hang your head like, I used to be an addict, just like people now hang their head. I used to be on supervision, but I don't want anyone to know that.
Right. I have not thought of that. But wow, what a powerful thought, right? And maybe we see that a little bit happening with fair chance hiring, second chance hiring, some of the employment initiatives, more exonerations happening, or at least the possibility, right? Yeah. Or for expungement rather to be happening. I mean, you're seeing a move, I think, in some ways to remove the stigma. I think very minimally at this point. That's not quite the same, right, as celebrating the success.
Right.
I think that's something we need to strive for. Mm-hmm. It's hard to change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's hard. It's difficult.
Yeah.
We need to give people credit for that.
Exactly. Yeah. And realize the ancillary effects of that, of not just for that individual, but for other people who may be struggling, saying, you're celebrating this person being crime free now. Just like, you're celebrating this person who's no longer struggling with chemicals. Yeah. I mentioned we are both on APPA's International Relations Committee. Share some of your international perspectives. I know you just got back from Panama. We were talking about that before we went live, but talk about some of the key differences or similarities at prison-based programs around the world. And speaking of challenges, what are some common challenges that you think we face as far as implementation with these programs?
The international stuff has been really fascinating, and I feel like it's a privilege to be able to go and do work in these other countries and learn about their systems. Most of my research at this point has been in Central America, El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, and Panama, as you mentioned. And, they face different struggles compared to what we do in the U.S. I think one of the challenges of rehabilitation and programming in Central America and South America to some extent is that we don't have criminology programs in these countries, right? So much like we see our students in the U.S. not receiving maybe the training that we would like them to have, you see a similar sort of gap in those countries. And at the same time, I can go down there and I can talk about R&R and I can talk about best practice here, but I don't know how well those best practices always translate, right? There are cultural differences, there are economic differences, there are religious differences that impact how people reintegrate into society. And so I think that when we consider those programs and challenges with implementing those programs, that again, we need perhaps more collaboration. Maybe that's my theme today, between between research done in the US, in the UK, in Europe, in Canada, elsewhere, and then research done in these countries that are maybe a little bit behind. They have drug treatment programs, they have sex offender programs, but they tend to be more education based at this point rather than behaviorally based.
Yeah, that is a great insight. We know this, that the devil's in the details with implementation. I mean, nobody's reinventing the risk needs responsivity model. Not that that's the model we should be satisfied with and never push forward. But yeah, even when we know the recipe, it's in the implementation. Yeah. As a quick aside, Deb, when you were mentioning Latin America, I've got a connection down in Chile, and she mentioned some of the same stuff you did with the differences and the similarities. But did you see a lot of issues with dealing with gangs in those nations?
Absolutely. So some of they're interesting, really fascinating places to visit and to work. Some of the challenges within the prisons, and it varies. Let me be clear, like every prison, just like in the US, is different. There is no, this is the model. But a lot of the prisons have either self-governance or co-governance. And depending on the prison, that might be that the gang is governing. I've been to some facilities where it's the gang leader that we need to get permission from to enter. And so that does create different challenges, right? Both for how do you operate in an institutional setting that you don't have full control over, but then also how do you prepare people to go back into the community and try and disengage from a gang when it's really the gang that's providing them safety. The church is really important in that context, but it's not always going to be enough. And so there are unique challenges that, I don't even think, I'm still learning, to be candid.
But that's great insight, again, that it's all about understanding the context. And I think sometimes we just almost do a drive-by on implementing these programs without realizing even subtle contextual differences.
Yeah, they will fail miserably.
Mm-hmm.
I worked with one jurisdiction, just as an aside, on implementing risk and need assessment. And the jurisdiction adopted an electronic system, which is great, except that they didn't have a sufficient number of computers. And so you're preparing people to do work that they just don't have the resources to, right? And no fault of theirs. It's again, these are system issues, but I do think, there's a real danger of sort of us in the US going to these other countries and saying, do this without being attentive to local context.
Speaking of this, and I know you've got a lot of experience with best practices, particularly around cognitive behavioral interventions. And again, we could circle back to within the context of drug courts for this, but how do those cognitive behavioral interventions really contribute to the success of those programs and reduce recidivism, which is what this is all about?
This is, I think, the $100,000 question right now. We know, right, the research is quite clear that behavioral interventions, cognitive behavioral interventions is where we're going to get the greatest effect. If we want to bring about sustainable, lasting change, we need to help people recognize the connection between their thoughts, their feelings, their actions. We need to help restructure those thoughts that pose risk for people, and we need to teach them coping skills, right, and social skills and ways to manage these situations. Within the drug court model, so we say use behavioral approaches, but the truth is research has not really been able to tease out the impact of treatment versus the impact of the model itself. Right? It's all sort of tied up and jumbled up together. So I and one of my colleagues right now, we're actually looking for a drug court. If you have anyone out there, looking for a drug court that utilizes a couple of different treatment providers. And we want to follow participants through the different providers and look at the differences in the providers, right? What are the techniques that they're using? What is the level of fidelity that they have to the programs or curricula that they're using? And how does that if it does or not, relate to outcomes.
Yeah, that is so brilliant. I know I'm an LSMI master trainer, so I've gone down the rabbit hole on GPCSL. Sorry, folks, general personality and cognitive social learning theory. But to your point, a lot of folks don't realize that those effect sizes are based on when Bond and Andrews studied the treatment programs and the efficacy of the treatment program. So there's a risk, excuse the pun, of a little bit of a disconnect there, right? And it's not getting at the individual. Well, you know what I'm saying. We're going
the quality.
Yeah.
No, you're right. So drug courts on average reduce recidivism 10-12%, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is significant. It's meaningful. That's why they've sustained. That's why we have the whole problem-solving court movement. But my gut would say if our treatment quality is better, right? If the treatment itself is in line with the research, then the outcomes should also improve. So stay tuned.
Exactly. Stay tuned. Deb, I always tell individuals that I sort of have speaking of the risk, need, responsivity framework, as you and I both know, that was 3 of, I think, 15 principles that came out of the psychology of criminal conduct. But there's also the fidelity principle. And I've sort of developed a love-hate relationship with the fidelity principle. I mean, I understand it, obviously, and the importance of delivering interventions as the authors intended. But I've also seen this sort of just do it, basically. And God bless my friends at NIC. But I know, for example, I think it's in the Thinking for a Change curricula for the trainers, they'll literally say, just read the script until you're familiar with it. Just read the script. And it just sort of conflicts with the responsivity principle, which says you really need to, match the learning style of the person you're working with. And I've seen, again, and this is more from the bean counter administrators that just want to check a box to say we ran people through this program, that there's this disconnect between it's not landing on the client. It's okay to improvise, for lack of a better term, or maybe more accurately contextualize it. But we just get so blinded by that fidelity principle that we don't realize this isn't working on a good chunk of these clients.
So important. So I like the fidelity principle. Let me just say that first. And part of that, so I think there's this tension between zero fidelity, right, or low levels of fidelity, and then this idea that if I just read what's in the script, I'm delivering something with fidelity. And I don't think that's quite true either. Where I like the fidelity principle is I think for programs, for directors, for agencies that are saying, like, how do I improve things? Well, first thing is make sure you're delivering the curriculum that you signed up to deliver, right? I've literally gone into groups that, here we're using curriculum A, and it's obviously they've never even seen curriculum A, right? Mm-hmm. Because they're talking about something else. So I like that we're talking about fidelity because I think it provides a structure and a guidance that's sorely needed because there's too much deviation still. But to your point, fidelity doesn't mean be a robot. Right? Just like with risk need assessments, with the LSCMI, like having an assessment tool doesn't mean that the assessment makes the decisions for you. You're the professional. You're delivering the material. You need to deliver it in a way that's engaging, that's meaningful, that's salient, that you need to establish rapport, right? That's all equally an important part of delivering an effective program.
I think, too, maybe my case is stronger if, to your point, it's one thing if it's in the classroom and you're delivering an off-the-shelf curricula, so to speak. But I know there's a good trend to, and it leans into the dosage principle that graduating somebody from a decision points group or a Thinking for Change group, you're not going to scratch the dosage. You need to do those one-on-one cognitive behavioral interventions with your clients in your individual sessions. And I think here's where I see more of the reluctance on the part of the practitioner to contextualize it with their client. I train it now sometimes, even if it's in broader things around save and case planning, that if we can train the staff members on the theoretical underpinnings of these concepts and empower them, then they can go out and they can realize that with their complex clients who have complex risk and complex needs, okay, here's how I can on the fly. I use different analogies, and I'll say, whether it's a cooking course, like, yes, you're learning how to make Deb and Joe's lasagna, and if you follow this for Christmas, you'll get our lasagna. But if you have somebody who's lactose intolerant or is allergic to olives or whatever, it's like you're not so blinded by the recipe because you understand, like, well, by heating the oven, this is what we're trying to do, and by this recipe, and then it's just you've created again, sort of, what's the term? It's almost like a force multiplier. Yeah. You're not just training, whether it's assessment or cognitive interventions. Oh, when I was in that course that Joe and Deb were the facilitators, I learned the client that looks this way and acts this way, this is the intervention, or this is how I should score the assessment, versus if you really understand social learning theory. I mean, it's almost like there's the joke about how when, children of the 70s, like I grew up and would challenge our algebra teachers with, well, why can't I just use a calculator on the midterm? Well, because Joey, you're not always going to have a calculator in life, right?
Little did they know.
Yeah, little did they know. It's called the cell phone today. But in their defense, what they were really doing was they were empowering me beyond, Joe, you're not always going to be presented with an equation in life that matches question 18 on the midterm. Just like, Joe, when you're training me, or when I'm training them rather, on the LSEMI, it's not going to be the Tom, Dick, and Harry illustrations. Yeah. So if we empower them to understand the theory, then they could level up, so to speak, and say, oh, it doesn't matter what client walks through that door. I know I'm going to deliver this cognitive intervention.
Yep. I think that's absolutely right. When I train, I always say, I want you to know the spirit of the item, because, I can't predict every situation that you're going to encounter. Yes. And so if you understand the spirit, if you understand the logic of why this matters, yes, then you can apply it, right? So that same thing. I think when you were talking about dosage and fidelity and the one-on-one, I think I suspect where we're really missing the boat right now is the individual practice, right? That we run them through the groups, we run people through these groups. They maybe do some role play there or do some practice there, but there's not enough of that practice. And so in the same way that you're suggesting probation officers, parole officers, staff need more training on how to use these skills, I think clients do too, right? So that it is second nature, so that it is natural and not forced and can occur in the moment when it needs to occur.
Yeah, exactly. 100%, Deb. Hey, speaking of the risk need responsivity model, share your experience delivering a TED Talk on R&R, what that was all about and what was that like? And more to the point, what was the message that was being delivered?
Yeah, great. So let me just say, I haven't really watched a lot of TED Talks or TEDx Talks. I think I'm one of the few people in the world that likes to read more than watch. So I had no idea what I was getting into, which is really important. But a friend reached out and asked if I would be interested in applying. And I tried to think about what is about R&R that's relatable to the community. Because that's who the audience is. It's the community. It's not correctional staff. It's not criminal justice staff. It's local community members. Why should they care about this? And I had a former relative who had a drug addiction problem before I was in grad school. Or actually, maybe I was in grad school. Anyways, had this problem, couldn't get help. We couldn't find resources for him to get the help that he needed. He lost his job. He went to prison for, I think, 2 years, and he's really lucky that he had a lot of good family support. And so he came home from prison. He was able to live with a family member. He was able to get a job. He's now, I think, been married for like 20 years and, grandfather, and life is really good for him. And he should, well, first of all, he should not have gone to prison. We should have been able to get him help. But his story of success, that should be the norm. And so the talk was about, really, that was sort of the starting point, but about how we need to do a better job about how we respond to people that struggle with drug abuse or alcohol abuse, and that we need to think better about how to serve them based on the R&R principles.
When you noted just then that his success should have been celebrated and that should have been the model, I'm going to quote David Best again here. We were talking and he said, the issue here is that in corrections, failure is visible, success disappears.
Mm-hmm. It's so true.
And if you think of that even through the lens of not just the public, but the practitioner, I would contend, probation officers remember their failures, that case that blew up with a reoffense or, an ugly contested probation violation hearing that the judge did find violation and the person went to prison. And they remembered those types of things, but they can't look back fondly on all the early discharges they recommended. Or even if they did, then that case disappears. They don't see what you saw with your family member, that he went on to get a family and a job.
That's right.
The only time you get, hey, whatever happened to, is when they're on the 6 o'clock news again for something bad.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And that's, I think, what's really exciting about the shift to coaching, right? And so I'm working on a project with Brian Levins and Shelley Johnson, where we're implementing the coaching model in 3 sites. And the idea in part is that organizationally, we need to celebrate success. We need to reward success. We need to emphasize success and not just the failures. And hopefully that can change things.
Brian's been on the show. He's a dear friend, and I'm aware of his coaching model. I didn't realize you were part of the team, Deb, so congratulations. Yeah, that's awesome to hear.
Thanks. Yeah. I'm part of the evaluation team. So we're in the launching phase, but we'll start really the evaluation in full earnest in a couple of years.
Yeah, I'm going to be excited to track the success and those updates. Before I let you leave, Deb, we should talk about the World Congress taking place this April in The Hague, and the fact that you and I will both be presenting there. Go ahead and talk about the World Congress in brief, but then more about what you'll be dazzling us with in the Netherlands come April.
Right. Well, I have to say I'm like a kid, like on their birthday, getting all the birthday presents, looking at the agenda, because I'm like, oh, this person is going to be there talking about this and that. So it's exciting. It's my first Congress that I'm attending. I think it's 1 day of talks or maybe 2 days of talks and posters, roundtables, learning opportunities, literally with people from around the world. And so lots of familiar names on there and lots of people I don't recognize, which I'm even more excited about. And so we'll be there doing a poster, not doing a talk, but we'll Shelley and I will be presenting a poster on attitudes towards coaching. So it will be related to the coaching model and trying to get a sense of, how ready are people? How do they feel about this model and this approach?
Oh, fantastic. I'm going to make sure to swing by and check it out and say hello. Yes, I will be there presenting. My audience has heard me talking about our innovative TIDES model, which essentially is a hybrid of trauma-informed approaches and those desistance theories, hence the title TIDES. We try to get clever there, TIDES, but it's short for trauma-informed desistance.
I need to call you for titles. I'm very bad at this stuff. I like that.
Yeah, we thought it has a nice ring to it. Yeah, and there's a lot of imagery that goes with it as well, with the rising tides and all that kind of stuff. But I'm like you, Deb. I was a kid on Christmas looking at the keynote speakers and the parallel sessions and the poster presenters. Yeah, and it is a who's who of correctional nerdery taking place in the Netherlands in April. So I'm looking forward to seeing you there, if not sooner, Deb. Deb Koetzle, thank you so much for joining the Criminologist Podcast. We will track your progress, and I hope to have you back on the show sometime.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Bye-bye, Deb.
Bye.
As we wrap up today's episode of the Criminologist Podcast, I am left with a profound sense of gratitude and inspiration from our conversation with Professor Deborah Koetzle. It's been an absolute pleasure discussing her impactful work and insights into the world of criminal justice and rehabilitation. I am particularly excited about the opportunity to collaborate with Professor Koetzle as fellow members of the American Probation and Parole Association's International Relations Committee. The work we do there is vital, and having the chance to contribute alongside someone as knowledgeable and dedicated as Deb Koetzle is something I'm going to be looking forward to. The anticipation also builds as we both prepare for the 6th World Congress on Probation and Parole in The Hague. It promises to be an incredible event, bringing together experts from around the world to share knowledge, experiences, and visions for the future of probation and parole. The chance to connect with Professor Koetzle and other leading professionals in this field in such a dynamic setting as the Netherlands is an opportunity I am eagerly awaiting. For those of you who want to delve deeper into Professor Koetzle's insights, I highly recommend her TEDx talk entitled Addressing Crime and Drug Use Through Community-Based Interventions. It is a powerful presentation that resonates deeply with the themes we discussed today. You will find the link to this talk in the episode description. It's a resource that's well worth your time. As we close this episode, I want to take a moment to extend my warmest wishes to all of our listeners. As this episode drops on December 23rd, I hope that you're all surrounded by peace and joy this Christmas season. Merry Christmas to each and every one of you. May this time be filled with warmth, love, and reflection. Thank you for joining us on the Criminologist Podcast. Your support and engagement mean the world to us. Stay tuned for more episodes where we explore the transformative power of criminal justice and rehabilitation. Until next time, keep fostering positive change and making a difference in our world. We will be back next week with a fresh episode. In the meantime, you may contact the show or reach out to us through our website, theparagongroup.llc.com, for training or presentations as to correctional skills, desistance from crime, or, of course, our innovative TIDES model. If you have questions or comments as to this podcast, feel free to contact the show via our email at thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. That's thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. Remember to follow us through our Facebook and Instagram pages at The Criminologist Podcast. New fun images are being added all the time to those feeds. You don't want to miss out. We are also on Twitter, also known as X. Give us a follow at Crim Media Group. That's CRIM Media Group. You may also connect with me, Joseph Arvidsson, or Professor Deborah Koetzle on LinkedIn, and follow both the Criminologist Podcast and the Paragon Group on our LinkedIn pages. Hey, lastly, if you've not already done so, check out and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Criminologist, for additional content as to the themes of this podcast. And if you believe in what we're doing on the show, if you're part of the movement, please spread the word, tell a friend or a coworker or a colleague about us, ask them to subscribe to the show, and of course, do so yourself if you've not already done so. And always remember, folks, there's no them, there's only us. Children of the 70s, like I grew up and would challenge our algebra teachers with, well, why can't I just use a calculator on the midterm? Well, because Joey, you're not always going to have a calculator in life, right?
Little did they know.
Yeah, little did they know. It's called the cell phone today.
The Criminologist Podcast is a production of the Paragon Group, LLC. For speaking engagements, interviews, program design, or training opportunities, please visit us at theparagongroup.llc.com. If you enjoyed the show, you can find more content and videos on our YouTube channel, The Criminologist. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Both the Criminologist Podcast and the Criminologist channel are brought to you by the Criminologist Media Group. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, and thanks for listening.